Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. Continuing on from the video I did yesterday about halflings and elves, the working class of D&D, which would be the humans and the dwarves. Now, if your setting has any sort of integrated economy where there's regular trade between the various races slash species of your world, or you also like have actual integrated civilizations where, you know, there's a human king in like all the various races, humans and the others that are allied with them all live under the same power structure. Dwarves and humans are going to be your main source for, you know, both agricultural and manufactured goods. They should, you know, be fairly common sights. They're NPCs that, you know, you need to, you know, have featured prominently in city and other civilized settings. They're going to be the people hauling equipment. They're going to be the people, you know, managing merchant caravans. They're going to be the people running shops. They're going to be the people working in blacksmiths, wood carvers, you know, the whole shebang. Whereas, you know, most of the other races in D&D, you might get some specific artisanal goods from them, specialty items, unique, you know, exotic things and whatnot. The basic stuff that all player characters need to survive and all the NPCs in the game need to survive, you know, just the basic needs of clothing, shelter, tools, food, all of that are all going to come from your dwarves and your humans. I guess we'll start a bit with dwarves. Things I like to do with dwarves to try to give them a little bit of flavor so that they're not just humans that have been mushed. Instead of giving them the exact same kind of king thane structure that humans have, you know, I tend to run dwarves as if they're all living under a corporate guild structure. A frequent thing I use in my own homebrew stuff is the idea of a dwarves guild, where basically all the dwarves in the world are all automatically born into membership in this guild, and the Dwarves Guild manages all dwarven services and aspects of life, even up to and including, you know, you'll have a guild church for the dwarf gods kind of a thing, guild libraries where you can actively pay for magic training, and also, like, because these are guild services, people can use and buy stuff and gain learning from the Dwarves Guild even if they're not dwarves, but only dwarves are automatically members, optionally gnomes as well, although gnomes should be a little standoffish towards actually ever acknowledging or taking advantage of the benefits of being automatically grandfathered into being members of the Dwarves Guild. I will tend to like have the dwarven kingdoms be something that have been like lost in history, you know, like 1,000+ years ago. For some mysterious reason, all the dwarven kings and all the dwarven kingdoms sealed their gates, and now like all the ancient underground cities that were, you know, once were, they're all, you know, sealed off behind massive stone doors that are magically sealed, and no one's opened them in forever. This is how you explain where Duergar came from. Basically, the idea is that, you know, like the dwarves had caught wind of some sort of terrible invasion of the Underdark, and so in order to be able to protect the surface, they sealed their cities down to make sure that the paths that those cities controlled into the Underdark wouldn't allow things to spill up onto the surface and stuff. Dark elves, illithids, you know, the whole shebang. Dwarves that are left on the surface are mostly going to be, you know, hill dwarves, the average dwarf that's out there in the setting, and the mountain dwarves are kind of like a small minority left who typically are members of the more prominent like household clans. You know, if you do give them any kind of like noble lineages, those would be your mountain dwarves. They're the rich, important families embedded in a larger hill dwarf society. And here and there, you know, you'll find small little younger dwarf holds and freeholds in some hills or in the woods or something for lumbering or surface mining. But they've never been able to really quite recapture, you know, the glories of old with the great big massive underground constructions and cavernous cities and all that kind of stuff. Giving them this kind of like mysterious, they're a refugee on the surface, but not because they were forced out of their dwarf holes, but it's because, you know, like they did it for some forgotten noble purpose. They don't operate like, you know, you got King Dwarf, Queen Dwarf, Baron Dwarf, Knight Dwarf. You know, you should try to not be too repetitive with how all your various racial societies work in your setting. If they're all basically just using the exact same imprint, then it also falls into the thing of like, well, are these really elves if they're using the exact same form of government as your humans, or are they just humans with pointy ears kind of a thing? You know, they still basically all follow the same hierarchy, and so you don't really want your dwarves to be doing that too. And so, you know, making them a little kind of odd touch of ultra modern, you know, where, you know, they're really concerned about having to have lawyers and contracts and business plans. Humans, as I've kind of been saying, like, you know, if you're running a fantasy game, you're going for probably like some sort of Middle Ages to late Dark Ages kind of a vibe with them. There's really only so far you can push what you're doing with your human cultures in terms of, you know, like what kind of style governments and societies they have, where, you know, like the further you get towards steampunk, the more it stops being fantasy and it starts becoming science fiction. So basically, you know, your other like alternative to you know, Middle Ages type stuff would be, you know, classical Bronze Age era, and other than that, you're kind of getting outside of what, you know, the core, you know, fantasy genre is. You want to ask questions of how integrated the allied races are into the human society in your setting. You know, are they separate but equal out there in the forest with their own equivalent societies, or with just engaging in a little bit of trade at the edges, or do they all acknowledge a greater common law, and, or, you know, some races have had to at some point in the past submit themselves to being ruled over by humans, kind of a thing, or vice versa for that matter. You know, you can always do something interesting, like, you know, talk a lot throughout the campaign about the king or the queen or the emperor, and don't really describe them that much. The player characters and the players just kind of like assume that, you know, they're indicative of the ruling, you know, race of the land they're in, and then when they finally meet him, it turns out to be a beholder or a dragon or something more exotic. You know, little twists like that can be fun. You know, humans are your backbone of most settings, unless you're pulling them out entirely. You know, they're your primary agricultural race. Halflings also engage in a lot of agriculture, but humans, just by virtue of their, you know, greater size and strength, can produce more faster for everyone. It's probably like a large chunk of how they're able to, you know, engage in any kind of economic trade with the other species of your setting, because they will typically be in control of more of the arable land and actually be using it. You know, like a tribe of orcs might control the high steppe plains, but, you know, they don't have the patience to, like, be actively farming it and developing the land and creating canals and all that kind of stuff for irrigation. Whereas, you know, humans are provably the species that does that kind of stuff, and so humans and dwarves are kind of like, you know, they're going to be your bureaucrats. They're going to be your average laborer. Typically, you'll probably have the humans being like the bottom level peasantry type roles, whereas dwarves, even dwarves who aren't mountain dwarves, will typically be slotted a little bit higher in the hierarchy, at least in the middle ranges, up until you get to the top of the human society, and then suddenly it's human noble families up at the top. So in a way, dwarves are kind of more like, could kind of serve like the middle class, the middle merchant, industrial specialist class, and humans kind of would sandwich them at the top and the bottom. Just a rather quick random little thought here. I was watching a video about dwarf lore in Middle-earth, and they were talking about the appearance of dwarf females and how they're indistinguishable from the males. And I paused the video because I had a eureka moment. Now, there's that scene in the Two Towers extended version where, you know, Gimli is talking to Eowyn and Aragorn when they're on the trail to Helm's Deep, and telling them about, you know, the misconceptions about dwarf females. And it occurs to me is, what if there's actually kind of like something more subtle going on there? What if Gimli is a woman? Now think about it. That also recontextualizes quite a bit about the relationship and mutual bond between Gimli and Legolas. And when viewed as you know, end caps to the prequel Hobbit movies that Peter Jackson later made, you know, you have a character arc now for Legolas, where, you know, in the Hobbit, he was kind of like, you know, snooty and looked down and confused and like, what are you doing? When Tariel all got the hots for Feely, or was that Keely? And you know, when you know, the whole, you know, elf lady dwarf boy fall in love, that whole thing that seems so odd and weird and out of place. Well, perhaps the real full circle plot arc there is that all these years later, Legolas himself now finds himself learning to love a lovely young dwarf woman. You know, I mean, it was said in the book that after everything was said and done, you know, Gimli did want to take Legolas down to go check out his glittering caves. Gnomes are kind of a unique case. Simultaneously, I can't stand them, but I also am very fond of them. I find them better than halflings, possibly just because there's actually more stuff about gnomes in mythology and fairy tales. Gnomes have a lot more personality, and that's kind of both their blessing and their curse. A lot of the people who play gnomes, I mean, I'm more likely to be okay with someone playing a gnome than playing a halfling, but also at the same time, part of me cringes because, I mean, certain kinds of people are attracted to playing these kinds of things. I like using them in kind of a subversive fashion. Nothing is more interesting than when you can successfully get a group of players to you know, buy into there's kind of silly, annoying gnome villain they're having to deal with, and then they finally actually witness that gnome villain doing something exceedingly heinous and evil, and it's just kind of an interesting juxtaposition of, you know, this small, seemingly easy villain to have to overcome that's just kind of silly, like a recurring gag almost in your game, is suddenly actually like, holy shit, this is like Jeffrey Dahmer level stuff going on here or something. That's the kind of ways I like to use gnomes. In my own homebrew settings, I tend to portray gnomes as being kind of atheistic, as a way of distinguishing them from a lot of the other races of the setting. And that, you know, one of the things I liked from 4th edition that they, you know, kind of leaned into is the idea that, you know, the gnomes had been enslaved once upon a time by the Fomori and the Underdark. And so I kind of, using that as like a backstory for gnomes, I kind of like imply there's this thing where, yeah, the gnomes used to be like, you know, held in bondage, you know, in the deep Underdark of the world. And it was their own gnome god, Garl Glittergold, who helped them escape. But in the process of allowing his people to, you know, escape the Underdark and reach the surface world, Garl Glittergold had sacrificed himself and is gone. And so since the essential gnome god is dead, they just kind of like don't care so much. So generally, even though it's not entirely forbidden, you're not going to see gnome clerics or gnome druids. Not even much in the way of gnome warlocks. You know, they will still lean heavily into other kinds of magic practicing classes. You're probably not going to see a gnome paladin unless you're leaning more into like the modern, that is based on just having taken an oath and less about any sort of like, you know, crusader pledging your sword to the church kind of stuff, as paladins were kind of a bit more portrayed as in older versions of the game. I feel like there should be like more debate as to whether or not gnomes should be classified as fae. Are they cousins of dwarves, or are they just a fae reflection of dwarves? Because I guess maybe that also leads into, are dwarves actually a fae race, or are they more related to humans and giants? I tend to, you know, in my own settings, kind of fork out the two family trees of the humanoid appearing races in that kind of way, where, you know, the Fey races trace themselves back to like magical origins, and they've split and sundered and bicker. You can play all that kind of, if you want to bring in Seelie and Unseelie court kind of stuff into that, you know, but I totally, you know, make a point of including orcs and goblins, and have in the past also framed dwarves as a Fey race. And gnomes. But if you're keeping the dwarves on the other tree, which starts as giants, and as giants devolve, you get smaller and smaller beings like ogres and eventually humans and all that. Dwarves could be a part of that too, in which case gnomes are kind of just more of the fey reflection of the dwarf, as opposed to being a slightly smaller version of the dwarf, which I feel like if you frame it that way, it makes them more distinct, because the way they're currently written in the book, they're just tinier, sillier dwarves. Also, because of my thing of having that, you know, the gnomes have fled the Underdark, you know, they're relatively, you know, like, how would you say, like, they're like a radical libertarian kind of people. They don't really want to like be living in the larger cities with the larger races, but their isolation is more genuinely like, just leave us alone in our little quiet community as far away from everyone else as possible. You might have like little forest communities that are, you know, relatively hidden and well defended, and they don't really advertise that much. Same thing with rock gnomes living in mountains and hills. The exception to all that is the deep gnomes. Since you know, my setting, I tend to, you know, I don't like the Underdark, so I keep the Underdark there as a presence in history, but I don't really have it be like a big open adventure avenue, because I don't know, it's just never been my thing, caving. But, you know, I still want to include the deep gnomes somehow in the setting, so those will be the gnomes that do live in cities and basically kind of like doing like a night shift kind of lifestyle, where, you know, they'll be security and various kinds of work. All the stuff they do is at night, and, you know, like they might have like a semi-underground neighborhood for themselves, kind of adjacent to like sewer level, even though they're not like, these aren't sewer gnomes, like that's goblin kind of shit. The player characters are the ones that like have, for whatever personal reason or actual mission they've been sent on, you know, they are the ones that are out there abroad in the world, and they're not like scared and xenophobic. They've been through shit in the past, and they want their communities to not, you know, be, you know, calling a lot of attention to themselves, because they don't want to, you know, become snacks / labor force for another race of giants. You know, keep an eye on your players if they want to play gnomes. They can, like, I don't know, it's hard to describe, because like I say, like, I'm both more accepting of a player who wants to play a gnome than a halfling, but I also, you're gonna be a silly, whimsical fucking weirdo, aren't you? Now, we got another kerfuffle of sorts over the concept of whether or not there should be racial modifiers in Dungeons & Dragons and associated games. As I've stated in previous videos, this is not exactly a new debate. I clearly remember when I was a youth in the early 90s hearing people make these sorts of accusations about D&D and how it's promoting biological essentialism. It's not like Skyrim, you know, where they actually, you know, have different racial modifiers based on different specific human ethnicities, because of the fact they're using race in a very old-fashioned kind of fantasy way. It's really more of a stand-in for the word species. However, you know, if you're looking for some sort of vaguely medieval kind of vibe to whatever the setting you're doing, a word like species seems a little out of place. So they use race. But unfortunately, because of all the huge amount of real-world cultural baggage that comes with that word, a lot of casuals who first dip their toe into the fantasy genre, you know, will react to it as if it means something different than what it means within that genre. The reason why you have racial modifiers for elves and dwarves and halflings and such, on those occasions when those have even been present, some of the early versions of D&D didn't have any ability score modifiers at all, but the rationale for their inclusion, including not just a racial bonus, but a racial negative to one ability score or another, is there because the entire basis of how you play a tabletop role-playing game is entirely built upon the choices that players make in this virtual mental environment you're creating. Everything is based upon giving them some sort of choice. Even basic combat is really about making little decisions and then having to deal with the repercussions and consequences of those decisions. From the very get-go, when you're making a character, you are starting to play the game, and the choices you are making should have some sort of effect down the line upon your gameplay. Otherwise, it's entirely just a cosmetic thing and doesn't even really need to be mentioned. But, you know, if you're choosing to play a dwarf, means that your character is going to have a easier time dealing with some NPCs and a slightly harder time dealing with other NPCs. They're going to have to deal with the consequences of not being as tall as an elf. The whole point originally is that, you know, before they started to warp how ability modifiers work, is that humans would just get a flat roll of their ability score dice, and they were just kind of like the neutral position. But, you know, after they got rid of the negative racial modifiers, they had to start doing things to make, you know, playing humans attractive. So then you get into this subtle thing of this odd human superiority that goes on in D&D, since they get a +1 to everything and extra skills and all that kind of stuff. The idea that, you know, certain D&D races wouldn't automatically be loaded up with certain culturally relevant skills to them. I mean, yeah, if you really want to play an elf that never learned how to pick up a sword, fine. But, you know, the idea that, you know, because of elven culture, they all are proficient in long swords. You know, how is that a bad thing? To make sure that, you know, if you're playing an elf, no matter what class you do, you always can still at least, you know, engage in sword play, even if you're in a class that otherwise wouldn't be trained for that. That's hardly like that's a punishment for anybody, and I don't really know how that's supposed to be viewed as some sort of negative reflection upon elf society. But yet here we are. This new thing of you know, just you get ability score bonuses, but you can put them wherever you want. Why even have that? If they can go anywhere, they're kind of meaningless. So we shouldn't. I guess I'll just go back to like the basic D&D style of things, of just everyone rolls 3d6 for everything, and you know, you might have a little difference in scaling on based on your, you know, size, if you're a small or medium and stuff like that, in terms of like, you know, how much encumbrance you can carry and such. But hell, why even have ability scores? That's not fair, you know. Like, and I guess that'll have to be the next thing. You know, you completely scrub down all the things that make the choice you're making of what race you want to choose in this completely meaningless. Then I guess the next thing on the fight to make sure everything's fair for everyone is to, I guess, just give everyone flat, identical ability scores. Not even giving people like, oh, here's some numbers to plug in. Everyone should have the exact same ability scores. Why should Johnny be stronger than Sarah? Why should Bill have a higher intelligence than Bob? All that kind of thing. Everyone should just be the same. Which further removes choices. It kind of like the trend line of all that is just, it's just gonna, the video gamification of D&D, you know, everyone gets the exact same avatar with the exact same skill load, with the exact same potential for success. In fact, you know, Billy might be a little upset if he doesn't roll well on his skill checks. So maybe we should just get rid of all skill checks and saves. Have everything you do be successful. Give everyone ability scores of 18. Hell, let's just put the ability score modifiers back in. Not only are all 6 of your ability scores going to start at 18, but then you get to add +2 to 6 ability scores of choice. The point of it being a game is that it has parameters, and you have to learn how to operate within those parameters to achieve the set goals of the scenario. I mean, like, I guess, you know, why even have classes? Why have skills? Why have anything? Why even have a role-playing game? Oh, because they want to make money. You know, we're facing a wall coming up here with this one D&D thing. Are we, you know, regardless of, you know, how you might feel about whatever, this expectation that we're all going to jump on board a virtual tabletop environment and have to make a bunch of microtransactions in order to be able to compete properly with others. That's way worse, because that's putting the fairness of the game based on like your real world ability to afford to buy resources as microtransactions. It's going to be based on your ability to afford to get your character the magic item model for, you know, for the little virtual mini. It's going to be up to you to be able to afford to buy them the armor you want and all that kind of stuff. You know, the dice roll stuff might not seem fair on the surface, but no matter who you are as a person in real life, you still have to be subject to that, you know, random factor when you want to sit down and play these things, no matter how rich or poor you might be. And I don't know, that strikes me as slightly in like an actual more true, honest form of fairness than making sure halflings and ogres can stand toe-to-toe to each other on equal footing on everything. Once again, I feel that a lot of the people who feel this way about Dungeons & Dragons in particular should probably find a different role-playing game to play, because obviously this is not something they actually like, but because there's this sensation of popularity around it right now, you know, people want to be doing the popular thing, because they want to engage and feel a part of popularity. They want to feel like they're cool and they're part of the zeitgeist. But I know you wouldn't ask for this many changes on something that you like. If you like a hamburger, you wouldn't ask them to replace it with chicken and take the cheese off. Say if you're gonna make up a role-playing game where you're playing animals, not animal people, but you're like playing animals in a forest, and everyone rolls up a little animal character, and you're gonna have just little critter adventures in the woods. Is the bear character gonna have the same stat range as the raccoon character? Really? Everything's the same when it comes to like physical mass, dexterity, problem-solving abilities? No. No, they're not. End of story. I've secretly replaced my wife's Folgers crystals with
Orc and Bone.
Let's watch and see what happens.
Well, good morning, Mrs. Queen Wasp Raider. I have your Folgers crystals.
Thank you. The hell is this?
Help your lady friends wake up the right way with Orc and Bone. It's not coffee.
Stewards and Obstacles. The only tabletop role-playing game adventure that allows you to take on the role of stewards of the world's most inclusive role-playing game, to fight hateful content and fully monetize your players.
For use with the Total Party System Rules Handbook. Available now on DriveThruRPG and Amazon.com.
In the distant future of 1999, Amazon time barbarians fight to liberate the women of North America against vast armies of trolls and chads under the control of the Rogan Joe. This original tabletop role-playing game is thick with 2 C's. Available now on Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG.
Hey, what the hell is going on?
What do you mean?
What do you mean? What do I mean? What's going on? You put
Orc and Bone
in my Folgers crystals. What even is this shit?
Oh, that's one of the many tabletop role-playing games that I have written that you can find on Amazon.com or DriveThruRPG. There is an irony to the whole thing, and it's not just in D&D and role-playing games. This has kind of been an ongoing thing within, like nerddom. Since I was a kid, and from what I can tell, probably extends to beforehand. The satanic panic and the current threat of boycott if X amount of diversity is not included. They're both related to each other and also not related to each other. There's been debate about racism and depiction of racism and how, like the rule system is framed around differences in player character races and all that kind of stuff, and whether or not that translates to giving people racist impressions about genetic determinism and all that other sorts of stuff in real life. These arguments have been with role-playing games since the beginning, and in a weird way, and the thing that kind of ties it in with Star Trek and a few other things, Lord of the Rings also, is that whether or not it was intended by the people who designed these games, especially with Dungeons and Dragons, it doesn't really apply to all games. A lot of it depends on what exactly the players are allowed to play. But with D&D, you have something kind of similar going on with what you have in The Lord of the Rings and in Star Trek, and that which you are having a deliberately grouped set of diverse characters who are going on adventures together for common cause. Often, with some sort of historical baggage between them in many cases, and learning to ignore that or overcome it and become friends anyway, and all that kind of good stuff. To which extent there might be racist themes in these various works are intended to be there so that these characters can explore them while still showing a more unified, universalized humanity. Because, using the D&D example, humans are all just the one race, and the difference in race in that game is whether or not you're an elf or a dwarf and all that other kind of stuff. This has kind of a dual effect. It depersonalizes the racist stereotypes by having them be packaged in a non-human form, while having all the humans being bundled together and all being kind of neutral to each other in that fashion. Also depicting humans in settings where there are distinct non-humans. Our minor little color differences and historical differences pale in comparison. They are distinctly a true other in a way that whereas humans might otherize each other, you're never really truly the other. You're just being treated as such by one group or another. So, like, inherently, D&D is based on an anti-racist message. And yet, though, because it's never really quite spelled out like that in the books telling you that this is what's going on, the author himself might not realize that's actually what he was doing. There's a common thing throughout a lot of different types of art, writing art, painting art, acting. Like, people don't always see exactly what it is they're creating. Even after it's done, they might not necessarily really see what it is that they have made. That's kind of for the masses to decide in many ways. As soon as your work of art is done, death of the author is complete. So, whether or not, Gary Gygax intended these games to be vessels for, like, a subtle anti-racist indoctrination in the players, to which degree, it succeeds or fails based on exactly what the dungeon master is doing, or also, the intelligence level and empathy and just how thick as a brick the player might be to, pick up on these things. Yelling at people, especially in nerd circles, like these are all people who are naturally attracted to all these various genre fiction expressions, be it shows, books, games, whatever, that have already been imparting all sorts of societal messages that you agree with, and now you're going to nitpick them and tell them that these things that we're teaching them to be less racist are racist, or sexist, or homophobic, or ad infinitum. There is a relation between the humans, elves, and orcs that is unavoidable because of the fact that they have the largest number of intermixed hybrid offspring between them, the half-elves and the half-orcs. So regardless of how you want to present their origins or their place or their role in whatever kind of fantasy society you're creating for your D&D world, you do have to consider exactly how, it is that they do relate to each other. And there is room there for, a lot of symbolic expression. I'm of the opinion that it's kind of both lazy and inaccurate to, try to graft either elves or orcs onto specific human societies. They're supposed to be above or below humans in some ways. Elves and orcs, kind of philosophically speaking, are reflections of humanity, but kind of split through a prism. The elves are kind of like a representation of all that's supposed to be the best of human qualities, the beauty, the art. They live in tune with their environment and have great works of architecture and engineering and all that kind of stuff in various D&D settings, and they're ancient and wise. Whereas the orcs are a reflection of everything bad about humanity, at least in terms of how we view ourselves in both of these instances. Because unfortunately, because we are all ourselves human beings, it's impossible to write anything from a non-human point of view. So inevitably, no matter what we do, even if subconsciously, there are elements of this kind of effect that goes on in pretty much all writings about these sorts of fantasy creatures. But in terms of why one is viewed as good and one is viewed as evil in simplistic terms because of the alignment system. That's why right there. Orcs are supposed to symbolically represent humanity's dark side. It's not that they are a reflection or a denigration of a specific type of human. They represent the things that we find foul in all of us. They're ugly, brutish, violent. Taking into consideration what elves and orcs are actually supposed to mean symbolically as mythic things, could better inform your storytelling craft. For several years, there's been this controversy about orcs and racism and stuff. Not only is it kind of a silly conversation to even be having, and kind of a false front attempt to get people to sucker themselves into making themselves look bad, as just kind of like just a large obtuse framing device. But the thing that also bothers me about it is that orcs as a depiction of racist stereotypes is the incorrect far left interpretation of orcs and how they relate to humans and elves. Now, I'm just going to put this to rest because I have found something. An old article from a Czechoslovakian newspaper reviewing the Lord of the Rings books. And this is back when, it was behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by actual, honest-to-God, real socialists and all that kind of stuff. The ring will not destroy socialism. Socialism under attack again. The land of evil, shrouded in ash and smoke, is transparently situated in the east. There, the working class that is working hard on developing heavy industry is represented by hideous and evil orcs. It is obvious that the author, a spoiled son of the bourgeoisie, has never known the beauty of manual labor. The inhabitants of the plentiful West are, on the other hand, elves, aristocracy, men, middle class, and hobbits, rich landowners. These live prosperous lives, and the only thing they are afraid of is the threat from the east. The forces of good, according to the writer, are represented by the aforementioned reactionary groups whose members know very little what hard work is. Their leader is Gandalf, who is spreading regressive ideology, by which he keeps the inhabitants of Middle-earth in a constant state of ignorance and fear of progress. It is no wonder, then, that Saruman, a champion of the oppressed and progress, is labeled a traitor and his tower is destroyed by a group of fanatic reactionaries. In the end, when socialism spreads into the Shire, Saruman is captured and punished by hobbits without a proper trial. All of this is supported by the capitalist realm of Gondor. But fortunately, nobody can destroy socialism by any means, not even by throwing an ancient relic into the fire. Stay strong, Mordor. Surrounded by enemy neighbors. Half-elves, I kind of feel like covered pretty much in the video that talks about elves, since I kind of feel like half-elves should be treated somewhat like tieflings, where they're not necessarily like the children of a human elf mating, but they're more the product of a human bloodline that has some elf ancestry. And since the elves are fae and are, partially creatures of magic, the human genes have never overridden the elf-like qualities, and the people descended from, that moment of crossbreeding. In much the same way that tieflings are generations removed from whatever succubus, or incubus mated with their mortal human ancestor. And if they were the direct child of both, they would be a cambion and not a tiefling. So obviously, though, large segments of whatever magical essence of devil that is, still carried from child to child to child, overrides, genetic intrusion of human qualities, because they would still keep breeding back in with the human population. You also have a thing of over time. Both populations would balloon out a bit and could potentially start, breeding amongst each other after they're diversified and no longer quite as closely related to each other. And so you can kind of create a stable population of half-elves and tieflings living within your societies, and the same with half-orcs. Even before they've started excising stuff from books recently, there's already stuff in these books about how, romance may bloom between a human and an orc in the battlefield, and they will consensually make love and give birth to a half-orc child, which I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that to a lot of us. That just doesn't really seem to jibe well with fictional reality, let's say. But okay. So, but if you have your half-orcs in the settings, just be a sub-minority within the larger human population of people whose ancestor had an unfortunate encounter with an orc some generations ago. You get the, away from the direct thing about like your hero is the child of rape and all that kind of crap. It's buried further back. Also, like with the half elves and with the tieflings, over time, those half orcs, especially with the half orcs, because it's not like they're going to have as much of an easy time, breeding back into human bloodlines. They're more likely to focus kind of on each other and end up kind of creating a stable half-orc population as if they were their own race. Half-orcs could, like, themselves also be interesting NPCs to be in control of orc armies and orc, clans and all that kind of stuff. Because even though the full-blooded orcs are way stronger and more ferocious and all that kind of good stuff, the half-orcs are more intelligent and... between tactical advantages that gives you and just like the practical ability to deliver on promises and on agendas and impress the tribe into like, you're stronger than him, but this guy like has successfully like won us all this treasure and captives and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to go with his plan, kind of a thing. It seems kind of natural that half-orcs that go back to the wild, so to say, would often actually end up rising in the ranks amongst orcs, whereas amongst human society, they're definitely going to be down there in the peasant classes, doing like the worst kind of jobs. Overall, for a variety of reasons, I wouldn't like have them be as prevalent in the setting as half elves. I'd kind of keep them more on like tiefling population levels. And as for tieflings, they're descended from succubi or incubi who, or some other devil that, had relationships with a mortal of some sort and had an offspring, and that offspring was raised in the mortal world, even if their mother was the devil. That family didn't stay in hell. They didn't like have a house on Avernus and all that kind of stuff. That bloodline has remained on Earth and has continued to breed in with human bloodlines. Consider the kinds of people that devils would be looking to have that kind of relationship with. Pretty much all your tieflings are effectively going to be nobles, even if they're had been rejected from their noble title at some point, or their family has been rejected. So that you don't necessarily have to give the player character the background of noble. It should kind of just be writ as assumed that like all tieflings are descended from someone who was important in some capacity, because why else would they have been attractive to like these entities who like they're trying to corrupt people and turn them into pawns and stuff, like and having to sleep with them to like convince them to come over to your side is one thing, but actively wanting to like bear offspring, because I would like to think that there's not a whole lot of people out there like trying to like force themselves on devil succubi and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like the devils weren't conscious of the fact that they're creating life. So yeah, it just that feels like that should kind of indicate that whoever it was that's the the founding mortal of this tiefling bloodline was probably someone important. And also if this is all part of some sort of devil alliance, then they should have manifested some benefit from this. They got something out of it. You're gonna go to that level of creating like a D&D version of the Antichrist without showing some sort of profit. So it's very logical that like amongst the nobility of whatever your kingdom, human kingdom is, that if not all of them, if optionally, but at least there should be a slice and chunk of the upper class aristocracy, noble lineages, if not the ruler themselves, could potentially should be tieflings. I also feel like there is kind of some debate I feel that should be had as to whether or not tieflings should be treated a bit more like a template, kind of a race, a sub-race kind of thing, like you get out of the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. And in some ways, like tieflings should kind of be that, because unless they're saying that humans, elves, orcs, and devils are all the same species and thus able to interbreed with each other, there's some sort of magical kind of thing going on, in the same way that like a dragon that polymorphs and has a child with a mortal creature, has birth to a half dragon as opposed to a dragon born. There should be dwarf tieflings, there should be elf tieflings, there should be human tieflings, gnome tieflings. That I feel like there should be more variety that way about tieflings, and less so worrying about like the variety of like which level of hell does and that level of hell's overlord does your tiefling reflect and making like all the plain standardized basic starting tieflings, like they're all tieflings that are somehow tied to Asmodeus. There is a lot of potential tragic, dour, grim, thankless heroism to be mined out of playing half-orc characters. If the setting is treating them properly, if they're too accepted and they're just like, oh, it's just a half-orc buying an orange just like any other day, like, well, is everyone getting in a twist over? The fear and the distrust from humans and elves and the other prettier races in the setting creates the payoff of the fact that, like, this person, has no, like, actual reason to be standing up for any of these people, but they're doing it anyway because it's the right thing to do. A lead game developer at Wizards of the Coast is saying that future D&D products will allow any creature to be any alignment, even devils. And so, of course, like, the whole framing of the article in question is that devils are going to be good guys. No, not good devils. How terrible. I mean, like, obviously, the various hot takes people are going to have on this, or hell, even the very obvious cold takes that people are going to have on this are already being said and done ad infinitum. I would just like to point out one thing. This has always been the case, going all the way back to the very most original versions of Dungeons & Dragons and all role-playing games. The standard stat block for monsters is just a suggestion. It's something that you can use on the fly for random tables, or just to help you save a little time, not having to personally handcraft each and every single last fucking NPC and monster and critter that your player characters may encounter on their adventures. But from the very beginning, it has always been encouraged for game masters, dungeon masters, whatever you're calling yourselves, to go off book and personally tailor, personalize, revise, and tweak the stats and concepts and lore and settings of anything found in any D&D book. It's part of the entire premise of what a homebrew setting is so that you can decide how everything operates, you can decide what the lore is, what the origins of the various creatures, how they interact, whether they're good guys or bad guys, or secretly good guys or secretly bad guys. This has always been in our control, and whether or not a book says that goblins are chaotic or chaotic evil has no actual influence on how you want to treat goblins in your games. So, in many ways, this is kind of a much ado about nothing. It's also not even all that much of an announcement. I could have sworn we've already kind of heard these sort of rumblings out of Wizards of the Coast already over the last year, that part of the shift that we are to experience in 1D&D is this more kind of universalized, do whatever you want, play whatever you want. That's actually kind of just undermined the premise of what a game is and just created into just a big sloppy life simulator where you can fight things or have tea with them, whatever you want. I mean, yeah, I guess that's about it. There's really not a whole lot to say. Game masters, dungeon masters, storytellers, referees, judges, lore keepers, whatever it is, the terminology that you find best suits your role as the person trying to run these games. It's always been entirely in your control how you want to present anything that the players encounter. The alignment system has always been controversial. Always. Going back to like when it was like the line between law and chaos, and then they add good and evil into the mix, and people arguing or not understanding or having different ideas as to how these things are supposed to combine. What is chaotic evil? What is chaotic good? What is lawful neutral? It's just something on your character sheet you can look at to kind of give you some sort of lamppost to help guide you through the fog of like, well, he's lawful good, so maybe he would react this way. If, and only if, you're having trouble deciding how your character should react to something. And in the end, the in-the-moment natural instinct of the player is what should win through anyway. So really, who cares? Yet here we are, though. I'm sure it's like Tons of people are up in arms over the idea that every once in a while you might run into a devil or a demon who's not have a heart of cold black ice deep in the pits of hell. I mean, like, as a Buddhist, good and evil don't even fucking exist anyway, so I guess suck on that. I don't know. I guess that's about as good of a controversy as we can get out of D&D this week. Old news, repackaged as if it's new news, announcing a change that is unnecessary because we've always had the option to do whatever we want to do with any NPC or creature we decide to use in our games. So congratulations, everyone. We did it. We finally did it. And you can do it by hitting like and subscribe. Check out Total Party Skills' publisher page on DriveThruRPG. Or buy print copies of those very same books on Amazon just by doing a title search. And until next time.
Stay waspinated.